Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. And today we're doing a book club episode. Today's episode is brought to us by Baker Academic, the publisher of today's book we're going to be talking about. And we have two of the authors on the book on our conversation today. So we have Dr. Benjamin L. Glad and Dr. G.K. Beale, and we're going to be talking about their new volume, Dictionary of the New Testament Use of the Old Testament. And it is edited by G.K. Beale, D.A. Carson, Benjamin Glad, and Andrew David Naselli. All right, so I'm going to read an endorsement of a guest we've had on our show before. But for honorable mention, we've had Gerald Bray on our show before, and he wrote an endorsement. But for sake of time, I'm going to read just one endorsement, and I'm going to pick Peter Williams. He's been on our show recently. So I'll read this about Peter Williams's endorsement about this book. The editors are to be congratulated for assembling a stellar team of contributors who present us with the results of decades of communal scholarly reflection on how the New Testament uses the Old. Far from merely summarizing existing knowledge, these articles advance our understanding of this subject, which is central for understanding Christian scripture. Great endorsement there. Before we speak to these gentlemen who have both been on our show before numerous times, very familiar guests, we're honored to have them back. Just go to our show notes, go to Baker Academic link. It's going to take you right to this book. Order it for yourself or someone you know. Order it for your church, whoever, a neighbor, your favorite teacher, whoever you're. So order this book. And then if you go to also other resources on our show notes, Twitter and Instagram are the best social media platforms to find us, daily content. Also, what we're up to, latest episodes, things like that. YouTube is a great platform that we are on, and our subscriber base is growing a lot on there. These conversations are automatically uploaded to YouTube via video format, if that's easier medium for you or preference over the podcast apps for audio only. And then our email address, if you just want to do the old school method of emailing us for a question or a comment or anything like that. And then obviously, if you are not at a church where you call home, you're not a member, you want to go to a confessional Reformed church or anything in between, find our local church finder link on those resources, type in your zip code. You'll find any one of the NAPARC churches, so URC, PCA, OPC, and others. So check that out. And yeah, let's jump into this episode. So I'll let Peter further introduce our two esteemed repeat guests today, Dr. Benjamin Glad and Dr. G.K. Beale.
Yeah, we've got Dr. G.K. Beale, who's professor of New Testament at Reformed Theological Seminary in Dallas, Texas, who are now recently celebrating the World Series champion Texas Rangers, not too far away from where they are. Happened a few days ago as the time of this recording, but by the time this comes out, it's been a little bit. And then we have Dr. Ben Glad, who's professor of New Testaments at RTS, Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi. Pleasure having you both on the show, Drs. Beale and Glad.
Good to be here.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah.
So, Ben Glad, how's it feel where Nick has been calling you Benjamin Glad? Because I'm sure that brings you back to your childhood where your mom calls you in because you're in trouble. It's like, Benjamin Glad, you come in here right now. You're in big trouble.
Yeah, it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing.
It's on the cover of your book. I had to read it the way it was.
I know.
So I'm gonna ask an icebreaker question because Dr. Glad's advisor at Wheaton was Dr. Beale, and so I want to ask on both sides. Dr. Beale, do you have maybe a quick story about Dr. Glad? And Dr. Glad, do you have a quick story about Dr. Beale that people might not know and maybe humanizes them a little bit? So Dr. Beale, if you can talk, actually, I'm going to go with Dr. Glad because I've actually heard one of these stories from Dr. Glad. So Dr. Glad, that's
Here?
a short little story about
Oh,
Dr.
no.
Beale that people might not know.
Oh, a short little one?
I've heard of the
Careful.
one where he brought his Greek New Testament to
Be careful. Be careful, Ben.
No.
where he
This
brought
is
his
a
Greek New
good one.
Testament to
No, this is a
Cubs
good
game.
one. No, this is a good one. Yeah. Yeah. So it before, yeah, so Dr. Beale would always prepare before class, and typically when a professor before class, I mean, it's professors typically just kind of scan over their notes, or just kind of it's not too intense. But for Dr. Beale, I remember before class, you just it's you got to give him an hour. You don't really, you got to just let him come over his notes, look over the Greek and Hebrew text beforehand, because he was so fastidious at his lecture prep
Mhm.
that you've got to let him. So if you wanted to see him or talk to him, you had to wait till after the lecture, and not before.
That is very similar to Dr. Van Drunen, extremely similar, where he had to get through his lecture and you could not talk to him because he would, I don't know if this is Dr. Beale, I don't want to speak for you, but Dr. Van Drunen would get a little annoyed if you talked to him before he's finished with his lecture. He's like, let me finish my lecture and then talk to me. And he would tell us that straight up. He had no filter. He's like, this is what's happening.
Ben, does that remind you of another story?
Which story is that?
Remember at Wheaton when the guy kept asking me
When
questions?
Kevin Colley? Oh, no, yeah. So there's another story. This story is kind of an appendix.
Okay.
And there was one class when this guy, he's a really good guy, and he was excited about asking questions, and
yeah,
he had to understand 100% of what Dr. Beale was saying, not 99, 100%. And so maybe a quarter of the way through the semester, this guy was raising his hand once every 5 minutes, 10 minutes, this kind of thing. And so finally, Dr. Beale said to the student, "It's more important for me to get through the material than you understand it." And I remember thinking, I'm like, wow, it was my first semester of grad school at that point.
Yeah.
I said, wow, this is the different world than what I'm used to. So
there you go.
yeah.
Dr. Beale, do you have any stories about Dr. Glad?
Yeah, he was my TA for many years, and he was supposed to lecture for me. All of a sudden, a day before the lecture, I get this email, and his wife's going into the hospital to have a baby, so they can't lecture. I said, "What do you mean you can't lecture? You committed yourself to that."
So, I forgot about that.
He's a man. He's not a man of his word. Just
That's right.
That.
That's right.
I like this.
He's more committed to his wife than he is to me. Can you imagine?
I forgot about that.
Come on,
That's
Dr.
funny.
Glad. Yeah, you gotta go. You have to lecture, and your wife can worry about labor on her own.
Yeah, in fact, I was teaching Greek. It's one of those stories you hear about. I mean, I was teaching Greek, and this is 2000. Gosh, so this was 2009-ish, somewhere right around there. And I should know this is my son's birthday, and so I had my phone, and maybe I had an iPhone there, but smartphones were just kind of coming out, and I had my phone with me while I was lecturing, which was uncanny because it was lecture time. But I told my class, I said, my wife is pregnant, she's supposed to give birth at any moment. And so she texted me during class, and she said, my water broke, we've got to go in. And I did. I said, all right, this was my first kid, you're not really sure what to expect. And so I remember leaving class. I can't remember if I finished the lecture or if I broke the lecture, but I do remember going and picking her up and heading straight to the hospital. right after that. I'll never forget that. Yeah. She texted me and it's like, we got to go or something like that. So it's kind of
Looks like Dr. Beale remembers this fondly.
And then you had the
Well,
nerve of calling me and say, I can't lecture for you tomorrow.
He's stuck
the
on that.
nerve, the nerve, still upset.
But
He still
Dr.
remembers
Beale,
to this day.
Dr. Beale,
How come you
my
didn't?
wife,
How
Brenda
come you
brought
didn't
it up the
lecture?
other day, man.
Did she really?
Yeah,
That's funny. That's
she
funny. I
remembers it.
forgot it. That's so
hilarious.
funny. Yeah, I mean, because the birth of my son overshadowed substitute teaching, so I had forgotten about that.
That's good. I like it.
Well,
So
sounds like Dr. Beale remembered the birth of your son pretty well then.
This is true. This is true.
Yeah.
He knows your son's birthday at least.
Yeah, it's probably in his email.
That's right. The day he broke his word.
Exactly.
All right.
Cool. So a more substantive question. I'm going to direct this towards Dr. Beale, since you were part of this before. So you edited with D.A. Carson commentary on the New Testament use of the Old Testament with a bunch of contributors. 16 years have passed. So that was 2007. This comes out in 2023. So some might wonder, and maybe it's obvious for some, like, oh, dictionary versus commentary, but some might wonder, like, what's the difference between the commentary and this new dictionary? So can you talk a bit about how this both adds to and then complements the previous commentary on the New Testament use of the Old Testament?
Commentary is basically going, you have each book and each quotation and major allusion discussed in the order it occurs in the book. And what we would typically do is look, if it's a full quotation, we would look at obviously the New Testament context, then the Old Testament context, and then how it was used in early Judaism, and also then whether the quotation was from the Hebrew or the Greek Old Testament or some variant form, or the Aramaic, and then we would focus especially on the interpretive use and then the theological use. So that's what we tried to do with every one of them. Most of the authors went through that pattern. Mm-hmm. So it's a commentary on the use of the old and the new. Now, so if you're, understand an old and a new passage, you're reading it in your Bible, well, you can hop into your hermeneutical lawnmower and turn the key on and open up our commentary. And if you're reading along and you find something like the word typology or Septuagint, then you can sit back in the seat of the riding lawnmower, which is this, and relax and kind of understand a little bit more what you're reading. So the dictionary will have essays on terms like typology, like Septuagint, and so on. So we'll define things that we use in the commentary that we didn't have time to fully define there.
Awesome. Cool.
Anything to add, Dr. Glad?
Yeah. Well, before you add something, I have something more to add.
Oh, there you go.
Perfect.
We're coming out with a revision of the commentary on New Testament use of the Old itself. In 27, 28, Dr. Carson and I, and we pulled Dr. Glad on board again so he can do all the work. And we're going to do that 2027, 2028.
Awesome.
Very cool. Dr. Glad, anything else?
Yeah, I was just going to add that Matt Harmon really, I think, put his finger on the difference between the dictionary and the commentary, and that the commentary is you're focusing on the intertextual trees, whereas the dictionary is you get to see the whole forest, like you get to see the whole landscape of what's going on.
So what you're saying is people need to buy both the commentary and the dictionary.
Yes, of course. And I'm curious to see what Dr. Beale thinks about this, but my sense is that the dictionary is perhaps more accessible to lay people, because there are 50 or so essays on biblical theology, biblical theological topics, and it's not as exegetically rigorous as the commentary. So it may even be more accessible to the church at large. That would be my thought.
What do you think, Dr. Beale?
In terms of accessibility?
Yeah, which one's maybe easier to get into for somebody who has
the dictionary? Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Dictionary, but you can still, even if you don't know Greek and Hebrew, you can follow the commentary, New Testament use of the Old.
Yes,
I will
yes.
say this, that there is a commentary on the New Testament use of the Old that is coming out with Erdman's. One of the editors, or two editors, one actually is a former teaching assistant of mine by the name of David Lincecum. And this is it's called Israel's Scriptures in Early Christian Writings. The other editor, his last name is, I believe, pronounced Henze, Henze. But it also, it's broader than just a commentary. They have, they do have a section on commentary, but they have a number of articles that are also kind of dictionary-like. Like they have Israel, the use of the Old Testament in Qumran, for example, and then they've got the use of the Old and the New. That's a part 2. And then part 3 are themes and topics from Israel's scriptures. So it's kind of a combination of a dictionary and a commentary. And the main difference probably between the dictionary and our work and that one is that most of the writers are not evangelical. Only very few handful, very few, a handful are evangelical. So it's going to be a different animal.
Totally. Yep.
I love that we already have metaphors of lawnmowers and trees to help us understand the stuff. So
That's right.
this is good stuff.
Like
so my first question is, getting into the meaning of why this book. Why do we need a dictionary to help us connect the New Testament uses of the Old Testament? More importantly, maybe to help that question, to why it's important as Christians, why do we need to understand how the New Testament uses the Old Testament?
Well, Ben, I'll let you answer that softball question.
Yeah, so I'll just answer it pragmatically, and then Dr. Beale can argue it more along theological lines. So the idea came to me in the fall of 17. I was on the way home from class, and I remember discussing on the new something along those lines, and I was telling the students, hey, if you want to learn about this, you need to read this book. If you want to learn about this, read that journal essay. And in other words, I had to tell the students to consult all these various resources. And so on my way home, and as I was pulling into my neighborhood, the thought struck me, why isn't there a 1-volume encyclopedia, dictionary, whatever you want to call it, that addresses all of these issues? And some of these issues are very complicated, some of these issues are less so, but there really should be a one-stop shop for the field of the New Testament use of the Old, because in the last 30 years it's really matured. And so I started thinking along those lines, and then Dr. Beale and I had dinner in San Antonio in the fall of 17, and over Mexican and perhaps a couple margaritas, we discussed this, and Dr. Beale was excited. He then went to Jim Kinney at Baker, and that really just started this whole thing. And so it was really just the lack of a one-stop shop volume that introduced the students to this huge and growing and exciting field. That's sort of the pragmatic issue. Then you asked also the more theological, why do we need to know this? And Dr. Beale can address that.
Yeah, why do people need to study and understand the New Testament use of the Old Testament? Well, the answer to that is just for seminarians and academics. No one no one else needs to understand the use of the old and the new. So how's that for an answer?
You're being sarcastic.
Discouraging.
That is a
Discouraging.
joke. That is a
Yeah.
joke.
Sarcasm.
No, everybody needs to understand
Yep.
New
yep.
Testament use of the old. Why?
Everyone reads the Bible.
Because everyone reads the Bible. But why does that mean you have to understand the New Testament use of the old? And the answer to that is, you want to answer that, Peter? Or you want me to go on and answer it?
You have
I'm
to
gonna
see
let-
Christ.
I'm
You have
going to let
see
Dr.
Jesus.
Beale answer this.
All right.
Dr. Beale is
The,
a lot
the
smarter than I
reason
am.
is because take the book of Revelation. Almost in every verse, there's an Old Testament allusion, if not two or three. You cannot understand the book of Revelation without understanding how it's using the Old Testament.
I thought it was about Black Hawk Chopters and Armageddon and stuff.
Yeah. And so generally,
My sarcasm.
not every other book contains an allusion in virtually every verse, but the Old Testament's woven throughout the books of the New Testament. And in fact, many people, you don't want to limit your study to Old Testament quotations alone, because most of the references to the Old Testament in the New Testament are not quotations, they are allusions.
Mhm.
And so you want to be really careful to pick up on the allusions. And one way you can do that is not only reading our commentary on New Testament use of the Old, but also looking at the margins of your Bible, where they will have these allusions in the margins also. And I would say that if you're really serious and you want a Bible with the best margin, and even if you don't know Greek, get the Nesalalan Greek New Testament.
Mhm.
And that
I've got one 10 feet in front of me.
what now?
I've got an NA 28 10 feet in front of me.
Nesalalan edition 28. You can go online, and I think the formal title here, let me just see.
It's a German title that I can't pronounce.
A minute. Yeah, it's the Novum Testamentum Graecae,
Oh yeah, that's the
Nesalalan 28 edition. So the reason you want to get that is, you might say, why would I want to get that? I don't know Greek. Because the margins are amazing. So get that book. I bought it for my wife, though she lost it, so I got to buy her another one. So, but it's very important. And in fact, this is such an important topic that we had a conference. I had 2 conferences last spring on teaching and preaching the New Testament use of the Old for elders and pastors.
Both you and Dr. Glad were there, I think.
That's right. Correct.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my answer.
Gotcha. So I
Good deal.
actually have a question based off of
Let me
oh yeah, go for it.
just let me follow up just one. I tell my students that there are around 350, 355 quotations in the New Testament, depending on how you count them. It's not all that easy to do with some of these.
Yeah.
But that's only about 10% of these intertextual or interbiblical allusions. And so there are right around 3,000 to 4,000 allusions. So it's just think of it like that. 10% of the time, the authors quote the Old Testament. The other 90%, they're alluding to the Old Testament, just to kind of put it in perspective, because most people think it's the opposite, that 90% of the time they're quoting and 10% of the time they're alluding. It's the data is the reverse.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that's a good bridge into my question. So this is both for how both of you got kind of into this field, this study, and then maybe some, since it's not a new field necessarily, but I think it's been advanced more recently and more interest in this. So first I want to start off, how did both of you get into, more particularly so, the study of New Testament use of Old Testament? So Dr. Beale, I'll start with you, and then Dr. Glad after. So what got you into this field in the first place? What was there Was there a way of reading the Bible, a lecture, something that light bulbs like I should look into this more?
Yeah, I had a professor named S. Lewis Johnson at the seminary that I went to, and he taught a course on the Old Testament and the New. And he was a very good professor, so I tried to take all his courses, and so that was I took that course, and and then it was such an eye-opening course, and he had a particular approach that was good. And so, in fact, I have a book called Handbook on New Testament Use of the Old, and in the front of it, I say this is just an expansion of the approach of the professor I studied under. And so I did, after that course, I did some independent studies on the use of the Old Testament in the New. And then when it came time to do doctoral work, I wanted to do New Testament use of the Old. So I asked this professor, I said, what area needs the most work on Old and the New in the New Testament? He said, Book of Revelation, without blinking. And my countenance fell, because I had no desire to study the Book of Revelation. It was just, for me, a totally futuristic book, which at the time I did believe, and my professor believed it was only futuristic. And so, I didn't even know the order of the seals, trumpets, and the bowls at that point in the book. I hadn't studied it hardly at all. So I just trusted him, and I said, okay, I'll do it. And so I did it. And that I ended up writing a dissertation on the use of Daniel in early Jewish apocalyptic and in the Book of Revelation, and then got that published. And then I was asked eventually to do a commentary on 2 Peter and Jude in the New International Greek Testament Commentary series. And so I signed up to do that. And about a year later, before I'd even started it, I got a call from Erdman's publishers and the editor saying, the person signed up to do Revelation has dropped out. Would you be willing to change? And I still remember him saying, you can keep both if you want. And I thought, I'm not going to keep both. But so I said, let me get back to you. So I talked to my wife about it. I said, we're going from 4 chapters to 22. That's a little bit of a different scenario.
Yeah.
And she said, well, just answer one question, Greg. What are you most prepared to do? And my countenance fell again. And I said, the Book of Revelation. So all of this has to do with countenances falling. That's what gets me into it.
Yeah.
So.
The opposite of number 6, the countenance upon
So
us.
it took me 8 years to do those 22 chapters.
There you go. Dr. Glad, how'd you get into this field?
So I got into it through Dr. Beale, but that's part of a larger question in that I grew up a dispensationalist, and I had gone to the Master's College, which is associated with John MacArthur and all of that. And so when I started at Wheaton College, where Dr. Beale was teaching, I was still inclined. I still had dispensational inclinations, but then learning about the Old and the New, it completely changed how I viewed Scripture. And it was a radical departure in many ways. And because of that, I had never grown up, never heard about the Old and the New, never considered that. It was never even on my radar. And I think because of that, it was in some sense addicted to it, because I had been misreading the Bible in a fundamentally wrong way for so long that I wanted the opposite, then to sort of put all the pieces together and to learn how these New Testament authors were latching on to massive chunks of the Old Testament, to the entire sweep of the Old Testament, to tell their story, to inform their churches how to live well. And so that's how it, it was. Yeah, I mean, that's really how it started, was through Dr. Beale's classes and through some other classes, and then eventually doing a PhD at Wheaton College under Dr. Beale. So.
Gotcha. Dr. Beale, did you know Dr. Glad was, or I guess Ben Glad at that point, did you know he was a dispensationalist and you were like, I'm going to change this guy?
No, I didn't. I just was throwing hermeneutical buckshot out in my lectures. Whoever it hit, I was happy for it to hit.
Gotcha, okay. Okay.
There you go.
But that was an amazing time at Wheaton. We had,
Yep.
we started the new doctoral program when I came, Doug Moo and I, and Scott Hafeman, a few others, and we started a new master's in biblical exegesis where you could have 25 or 30 coming each year, and a lot of people from Moody Bible Institute, the Master's College, et cetera. It was a really unique time, I think, at Wheaton College. And so it was a very exciting time. And the old and the new played a big role in that. We had a required course, which was called Canonical Biblical Interpretation, which really is old and the new.
Sure.
So that was a lot of fun.
Awesome.
This was also during the time when the young reform crowd was emerging. So this is early 2000s. So with John Piper and this whole thing, things were really kind of shaping up nicely for my generation, and thinking about Reformed theology, which is then connected to covenant theology, of course, and then Old and the New, and this whole thing. So it was really, I mean, God really providentially brought a number of threads together here.
Awesome.
Yeah, the oven was preheated for you guys to.
It was preheated. It was preheated.
More analogies there. So on a practical note, how does the structure of your guys' book help the reader or the person using your book? And is it user friendly, or how is it applied? Could you paint a picture for us?
Ben, you want to answer
that? It's alphabetically or arranged.
So it's pretty easy to grab and go.
Yeah, the best thing about it, at the beginning, Baker decided to list the articles. They listed the article on, this is page 7, Roman numeral 7. They listed the articles in alphabetical order. Of course they did. But then the next page, on page 9, they listed they grouped the articles by subject matter. So for example, there's a whole list of surveys of biblical books. So whether it's Genesis or Leviticus or the pastorals, so they group those together so that the readers can see, oh, there are surveys from Genesis to Revelation in this volume. And then they list out the biblical theological topics, such as like Adam, circumcision, church, covenant, creation. So then those are grouped together. And then we have Jewish exegetical traditions, which is the most complex, in my opinion. It's just all these various Jewish texts that use the Old Testament and how those are arranged. And then finally, 2 more. We then have interbiblical exegesis, which just means topics that are germane to this field, such as allegory, apostolic hermeneutic. Should we imitate them? What does it look like? And definitions of quotations, allusions, echoes. And then the last category is systematic theology, that covers biblical theology, Christology, these sorts of things, theological interp. So what this dictionary is immensely broad. We do many things with it, which is why I think this is a great place to start the conversation. And it's arranged alphabetically, but in order to get a sense of what it is, you have to go to these introductory pages and see the scope of it.
So it's just go to pages 7 through 10, the new reader, and just cast your eyes down the list.
That's right. That's right.
If you're looking for something, then as you're casting your eyes, look for that particular topic, and you'll probably find it.
Probably.
So that's
very extensive.
Pages 7 to 10. We should have put pages 7 and 10 as part of the title, Ben.
We should have. We should have. I obviously, Baker sent me and Dr. Beale a number of copies But I really look forward to using this in Accordance or in Logos because there are thousands. I don't know how many cross references there are in this thing, how many the indices are extensive. It's thousands. And just to search these would be absolutely amazing because there are so many texts discussed, whether it's Jewish text or biblical text, but to have that at your fingertips and to easily look that up on a computer is worthwhile. So I'm really looking forward to the digital version of this.
It's the scripture indies are from pages 891 to 964.
Oh my God.
Almost 100 pages.
Yeah, and there are four columns.
Four columns on each page.
Wow.
In the font is microscopic.
We don't
I
often get excited about
those.
indices.
I
Besides when it's
composed
this.
those all myself. I did it. I composed it all myself.
Oh my gosh.
Didn't I, Ben?
Yeah, everyone. There's lots of sarcasm today.
That's a joke. That's a joke.
So here's a fun little thing. So Baker, when they were working on this volume, they played around with the font. And if you were to compare this volume to the commentary on the New Testament to the sister volume, this volume is physically smaller.
I was about to say that's
lighter.
much thinner than the commentary.
It's not much thinner, but it is thinner.
I guess
and
visually it looks thinner. Yeah,
it is, and that's because it is thinner. However, the word count is right around the same, and that's because they manipulated the font, and the margins are tighter in this volume, with the result that this volume is a lot handier. Is that a word? It's easier to grasp. It's easier to read, even though it's a little bit smaller. It's fascinating what they were able to do.
It's more user friendly. Don't you have the lingo?
User friendly. That's the word. That's the word I was thinking. Sorry, I made it so
there you
difficult.
go. You need that marketing lingo. It's user friendly.
Yes,
it is
more user friendly.
I even said that in the question, user friendly.
There you go.
Yeah, it is. It is.
From
and
a
so
marketer himself.
Baker told me that in the revision of the commentary of the New Testament use of the Old, they're going to do the same thing there. So the revision in the commentary is going to be between 10 to 20% larger, but because of what they're going to do with the font, they're going to do the same sort of thing in the font. It's going to be the same physical side, maybe even a little bit smaller.
If you got bad vision, this is bad luck for you.
Well, this is why God gives us glasses and all sorts of things.
I was gonna say too, to add to the reason for my question for the audience, too, is that this book, people are gonna have a question or trying to look for something and then grab the book. It's a good book to have on our shelf as research and backup. It's
reference. Yep.
Reference book. There we go. For user friendliness. So they're already approaching the book with trying to find something to answer something versus just God bless you if you read it cover to cover, but
it's a pleasurable read from page 1 to 960. Yeah, that's something else.
I think you're grabbing it off your shelf, trying to find something. So Dr. Beale, you explained it, if you go through those pages, you're probably going to grab something you're looking for that you're already approaching the book with.
Yeah. It's only 4 pages. That's it.
I know.
That's it.
Now, let me say there's a second element here. Let's say you're not looking for a topic, but let's say you've been reading the Bible and you find a passage and you want to know what it means. You look it up. Let's say it's an old and the new. You want to know what it means. Or let's say it's old and the old. You want to know what this passage means. Well, go to the scripture index, and that will tell you all the pages where that passage is discussed. Now, the second thing you want to do is also go to the commentary on the New Testament use of the Old. And between those two things, if we haven't satisfied the reader, then we'll just cry.
You did your best.
you don't want to make them cry. Yeah.
Yeah. If you're a pastor or a Bible study leader, then most of the bases are covered here.
Yep.
I mean, because we go
I
through
use the
every book of
commentary
the Bible
myself all the time when I'm preparing for sermons.
Right. but this volume has not just the New Testament, it has the Old Testament too.
Ah, okay.
And we give nice overviews of these things. So really, if you're teaching or preaching on a book of the Bible, or you want to latch onto a theme, it's probably here. Like it's exceedingly wide in its scope, and for students and professors, the bibliography is up to date as much as possible. So it's, I think it's an exciting and unique work.
Peter, if you're using it a lot and you're
Mhm.
finding it profitable,
Mhm.
and if others are finding the same thing, having the same experience, Ben and I do have a link. It's a link for tips. That is money. So any extra money you want to send
That's
us
right.
because you're
Venmo.
experiencing happiness over it, we're happy to receive that. Ben, can you send that link?
Yeah, my
after the podcast?
Venmo account's always open for business.
So you're calling this like thank offerings? We'll just send over thank offerings to the Beale and Glad account.
You know
There
what?
you go.
I put it crassly. You put it theologically, Peter. Thank you.
You're welcome. And that brings me to a theological question. And you both already kind of talked about this. And just in general, I'm thinking, and Dr. Glad talked about this. What does it mean for the unity of the Bible, for how the New Testament uses the Old Testament, how the Old Testament uses the Old Testament itself? What does it mean for the unity of the Bible and ramifications for us reading this as Christians? It's what does this mean for us reading the Bible and the unity of the Bible itself?
You want me to start, Ben?
Sure thing, Doc.
Thanks, Ben. Well, basically, the writers of the New Testament are referring to the Old, because the Old, and this is usually the case, the Old is fulfilled in the New.
Mhm.
And so that immediately produces a unity. They're quoting and alluding to these Old Testament prophecies because there's a unity. Old Testament prophecy fulfilled in the New. Now, but you have to be careful, because Old and the New can be hard. And so, for example, there are many prophecies where you have prophecies about Israel that are that they'll be restored in the end time. And Paul, for example, or Jesus will take those prophecies and say they're fulfilled among Gentiles predominantly, among predominant Gentile churches. Well, that immediately raises a flag, because the Old Testament prophecy was restoration of ethnic Israel. How can that prophecy be fulfilled in a church that are predominantly composed of Gentiles? And so you've got to answer that question with regard to Old and the New. I think the first thing it shows is that the church, in fact, is true Israel. They're considered to be Israel. They're fulfilling those prophecies. But then the question more deeply, how can they be considered Israelites, since they're just recently converted, unethical Gentiles that have been converted? And so, well, the answer to that is Christ. And of course, he unifies the scriptures. I think all scripture is Christ-centered, and it's Christ-oriented, has a Christ-oriented goal. But Christ himself suffered the exile that Israel should have gone through. And he was obedient, they weren't, but he suffered their exile. And when he rose from the dead, that was the restoration of true Israel. In fact, Isaiah 49 says he is true Israel. You are my servant Israel. That's a suffering servant of Isaiah 53. And so, therefore, when Gentiles trust in Jesus, they come into union with him, they take on what he is. And one of the things he is true Israel. That's how they can fulfill those prophecies. So the answer to the unity of the Bible on that, and why this is not a misuse of the Old Testament, is that it's Jesus that's the key to them becoming those who fulfill these Old Testament prophecies. And so likewise, too, you have prophecies of the Messiah that are seen to be fulfilled in the church. Well, how can that be? Same thing. What's true of the Messiah is true of those who come into union with him. And so what's prophesied of him can be prophesied of them. And and then, you have these passages where historical narratives like Hosea 11:1 and Matthew 2:15, out of Egypt have I called my son. And Matthew says that's a fulfillment of what the prophet said. But Hosea 11:1 is not a fulfillment, a prophecy. It is just a description of Israel coming out of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to begin to see that what's going on here, there's a whole philosophy of history whereby Old Testament events foreshadow New Testament events, and they foreshadow them even prophetically. So, and in that particular case, if you study Hosea, he saw there was a first Exodus throughout his book, and throughout his book, repeatedly, he sees there's a final end time Exodus. So if you ask Hosea, is there a relationship between those two? He would say, of course there is. And it's not just that the last is like the first Exodus, but that the first points to the last. And so Matthew's not doing anything new. He's just reusing the interpretive method of Hosea. So anyway, these are all the ways that show that the Bible is one in that regard.
Yeah. Anything to add, Dr. Glad?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add is that the New Testament authors, whether it's the Gospels or in the letters or Revelation, of course, the authors they're pulling the story of the Old Testament into the person of Christ, as Dr. Beale just mentioned. They're proving that the church is united to Christ. The story is continuing, and therefore it makes a massive ethical difference. Every author tells the audience, live in light of this end time reality. You are joined to Christ. You're part of the people of God. You're part of Israel. You need to live like it. And that's found in every New Testament book, as far as I can tell. And so it not just has a theological piece to it, but it has an ethical piece to it, that ethics are tied to the unity of the Bible.
For example, Israel was to be a priest to the nations. Exodus 19:6, and they weren't. And in the latter chapters of Isaiah, it says in the end time they will, and then all of a sudden the church is said to be a kingdom and priest, Revelation 1:6 and chapter 5 and verse 10. And so practically, what does that mean? That means that what's a priest? We're to be mediators between God and humanity. And so that's part of the basis for evangelism. And we're to be mediators. We're to be priests and mediating the word of God to the unbelieving world. Now, there are other aspects that are very practical about priesthood. One more I'll mention. 2 Corinthians 6 says we're a temple and that we're also priests. And then it says, that's at the end of chapter 6, and chapter 7, verse 1 says, therefore, having these promises. Wow. What promises? Well, at least the promises you become a temple and priest. Having these promises, let us cleanse ourselves of defilement of flesh and blood, completing holiness in the Lord. And the idea is this: since you have these promises, you begin to fulfill the promises of the temple, being priests in the temple. What did priests do? They kept the temple clean. And so you've got to keep yourself ethically clean if you're a part of the true temple. So that just fleshes out what Dr. Glad was saying.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. Peter and I are just started recording our season 7, finding Jesus throughout all of Scripture, and we just finished recording Numbers. So we just started going episode pretty much in chronological order through the Bible. And we're going to use this book, I think, this dictionary book, we're going to use as a reference for this season, I think. And, we can help promote it. And on each episode, just shout out, to you guys that this is, from Genesis to Revelation, we see Jesus Christ throughout all of Scripture. And that's very important for Christians to know. And we just kind of go through each episode book by book. Obviously, it's not 66 episodes, but we go through it. And so, yeah, we'll promote your book through this season. Thank you so
much.
Yeah, that'll be helpful.
Obviously, you'll be okay with that.
No, please don't. Let's keep it away from the podcast.
closing out, I want to pull an extra theological thread here, something that, maybe grinds your gears on what you find to be repeated connections that are really important, but frustrates you that most Christians don't understand in that connection between the New Testament and the Old Testament. So what are some big connections or examples that Christians seem to not understand or haven't been taught, where the New Testament passage makes much more sense with the Old Testament connection? Anything that grinds your gears that you kind of want to close out? Dr. Beale, I know you talk about Revelation eschatology stuff quite a bit. I'm sure you got some that you can think of.
No one messes around with Revelation that bad.
Well, I think that even I find Reformed Christians in churches, and of course, I'm only speaking from my limited experience, but I have been in Reformed churches for a long time. I'm ordained in one denomination that's Reformed, and I find that even Reformed Christians, but it's even more true of evangelicals in general, that they don't appear to be very conscious of that connection, that Jesus is true Israel and the church is true Israel, because that really unifies the Bible, and it does change the way you live. And so now the reason many evangelicals don't connect that is because some are dispensational, whether they know it or not. And then, but even Reformed Christians, I find, still have the shadow of dispensationalism with them. A lot of them have grown up in that and then have left it, but they haven't left it completely. They need to continue to shed the baggage of Egypt. And so, anyway, so I think that's a concern, and Reformed Christians also don't seem to be that conscious of it, including pastors, I would say. So I think that is something that is a concern of mine.
Sure. Yeah, that's systemically, dispensationalism is in the American waters so much in our churches that we don't, like you said, don't even realize it.
Yeah.
And a lot of us grew up in dispensational. I grew up in a dispensational background. Dr. Glad, you did. So, Dr. Glad, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I'm 100%. I tell my students all the time that I see a lacuna in the preaching there of those identical themes. So let me also mention this. This is not a theological point. This is a practical point.
Yeah.
And I am astounded how many times I hear a sermon on a New Testament text that includes a quotation. Won't even talk about allusions.
Yep.
But a quotation. But it amazes me is that how many times a pastor will preach a passage that contains a quotation and they don't do anything with it. They don't even bring up, hey, this is, Paul quotes Ezekiel, whatever, or Isaiah, whatever. I mean, they just mow right over it. My sense is that they don't know what to do with it. I think that's why they do that. But it still astounds me to this day. And I go to a Reformed PCA church, and not just there, but just in chapels that I listen to, and just broadly speaking, it really is, it's an impoverished preaching, and it causes problems because everybody's staring at their Bibles going, hey,
what about this?
What's that doing here?
Yeah.
I don't know if Dr. Beale has that same experience, but that's just anecdotally.
Exactly the same experience. That's why we decided to give those 2 conferences last year on preaching and teaching New Testament use of the old for pastors and elders.
Yeah, it's one thing for, like you said, Dr. Glad, explicit quotes and to just kind of brush over them, which is bad in itself. And then that's maybe where this dictionary and the commentary comes in. It's the allusions, it's intertextual stuff that if we're missing the quotations, for sure we're missing, essentially.
Oh yeah, yeah. Because if you're missing the quotations, you're missing.
If you're missing the surface,
quotations are only again, as I mentioned before, quotations are only 10%.
Yeah.
So you're missing the other 90% too. And it's now I can guarantee you this: if the word justification
Yeah.
is in
You're going
that
to touch
passage,
that. Yep.
well, now we're going to spend 20 minutes on that, which is, I get it, it's totally fine.
Yeah.
But we've got to, pastors and teachers, we've got to fix this problem. And I think we have all the tools.
Mhm.
We have all the tools necessary. Good commentaries talk about it. There are so many resources out there that discuss these things.
There's
It's
this brand new
really
dictionary, the New Testament use the Old Testament that's coming out. That's also going to be pretty helpful.
That can be had for $38.99 on Westminster sale. Yeah, we're running out of excuses now, in other words, to deal with these things. And we're not talking about things that are peripheral to the text. These quotations and allusions are the bullseye of what the New Testament authors are doing. And so the idea then, I think that Doc and I are trying to say is, if you're not talking about these things, and what are you talking about?
Yep, totally. No, I think it's
the best way to learn to preach redemptive historically
100%.
when you're in the New Testament. Look at the margins.
Yep.
I call it marginal theology.
That's one way of describing it. Well, I still remember at Westminster, and we'll conclude after this, at Westminster, California, under Troxel, we would fail our preaching course if we had an Old Testament allusion, if we had an Old Testament text of any sort, we would fail it if we did not bring up anything about it whatsoever. He was. I saw people fail their preaching exams and preaching courses when they missed it.
I love it.
They were dogged about it. That's like, if you miss this stuff, you miss the point.
And Dr. Troxel also does discourse analysis.
He taught us a lot of stuff. Him and Bittner were the two people. They would.
You have the combination of New Testament and homiletics like that, you can't go wrong.
No, that's what we were trained. I mean, it wasn't perfect. I mean, no seminary is perfect, but they got us on this stuff, and they did not like. They were kind, but they did not care if they failed you and said, like, yeah, you missed it. This is not what you're supposed to be doing. Well, Doctors Beale and Glad, thank you so much for all of your work, for helping Christians, helping pastors, helping scholars, whoever they may be, lay people up to academics, to read the Bibles better, Jesus-centered, and with an eye towards New Testament use of Old Testament and whatever form that may come, in New Testament, how to read Old Testament better in light of this. So thank you so much for writing this book and pulling in contributors and editors and all this stuff to help the church better read the scriptures that were given to her by her Lord. So thank you so much.
Okay, it's good to be on your podcast again. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks so much for your thoughtful questions. I had a great time.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you guys.